Do you know that some of the first soldiers in Hitler's armies feared in Europe weren't European at all? Most people don't. History rarely mentions the African battalions who charged through snowstorms, retook French towns, stormed German positions, and left footprints in frozen mud thousands of miles from home. They fought in wars that weren't theirs and vanished from the victory parades that followed. But today, we open the file they tried to bury, because this is not just a war story. It's a story of courage, stolen, erased, and now reclaimed.
Act 1. The Men Who Arrived in the Snow. The snow fell in slow, silent flakes, the cold that bites through uniforms and into bone. Europe was drowning in winter. And into that winter stepped men from lands where rain came warm and the sun carved its name into the earth. They were the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, though Senegalese was merely a colonial label. These soldiers came from Mali, Chad, Guinea, Niger, Burkina Faso, the Ivory Coast, and far beyond. France grouped dozens of people into one name because colonial paperwork loves shortcuts. Their ships groaned into the docks of Bordeaux, each carrying men staring at their own breath for the first time. One soldier reached out to catch a snowflake and asked, "Is this ash? Who is burning something?" Another joked, "If the spirits of my village could see me now, they would say, 'My son, what did you do to deserve this punishment?'" But beneath the humor, something heavier hung in the air. These men had crossed oceans not as tourists, not as volunteers, but as subjects of the empire. Some enlisted willingly, seeking pay, adventure, and honor. Many were pressured, some were forced. A few were told, "Fight for France and your village will be spared taxes," which is history's version of an offer you can't refuse. Yet once they arrived, something unexpected happened. French officers watched them disembark and whispered among themselves. Reports from the front had already spread. The Germans fear them, not because of any magic trick, but because German propaganda described them as ferocious, inhuman, night warriors. Fear rooted in racism, yes, but fear nonetheless. The Tirailleurs Sénégalais themselves? They just wanted to know why the cold felt like punishment from all the ancestors at once. They boarded trains toward the Belgian front. The metal seats froze through their trousers. The windows rattled. Villagers along the tracks stared as if they were watching ghosts pass by, African soldiers heading into Europe's war. Many of these men had never seen a train before. Now they were on one heading straight into artillery fire. One officer tried to give a motivational speech. "France counts on your bravery." The men nodded politely. They did not come all the way from Bamako, St. Louis, or Timbuktu to embarrass themselves now. Pride can be heavier than a rifle. By the time they reached the trenches, the snow was waist-high. The smell of gunpowder floated in the air. Machine guns rattled somewhere ahead like angry metal insects. Europe was about to learn a truth it never expected. When African soldiers stepped into the snow, the war changed.
Act 2. The First Blood in the Mud of France. The trenches of the Western Front smelled of damp earth, gunpowder, and the kind of fear that settles into your clothes. But to the newly arrived African battalions, there was something else, an unfamiliar silence that came before the storm. When the tirailleurs first stepped into the Allied trenches, French soldiers glanced at them the way one looks at a miracle they didn't expect and a mystery they didn't understand. Many had heard stories. They don't fear death. They fight like thunder. They can see in the dark. The usual myths that happen when cultures collide, and no one bothers to fact-check. One French corporal offered a cigarette to a young tirailleur who had never seen one. The soldier sniffed it and said, "So this is the smoke that rules Europe?" He coughed after the first puff, then declared, "I prefer the smoke of my village cooking fire. At least that one comes with food." But humor faded quickly, because the Germans were testing the line. Mortar shells landed like iron raindrops. The sky flashed white. The ground shivered. French officers shouted orders, but the tirailleurs didn't need translation. War has a universal language. It happened during a dawn assault, the first real test of African troops in Europe's industrial killing fields. The Germans pushed hard, confident they could break this new section of the line before breakfast. They were wrong. When the machine guns jammed from frozen mud, the tirailleurs charged with bayonets. When German grenades hissed into the trenches, they kicked them back like burning stones. When the enemy tried to flank them, they switched positions without waiting for permission, fighting with a fluidity French officers weren't used to. One French sergeant later wrote, "They fought as if they had been born inside these trenches and as if the cold itself feared them." In reality, the cold did not fear them at all. The cold hated them equally. Fingers froze, water canteens turned to ice. A tirailleur from Mali whispered through chattering teeth, "If I survive this, I will never complain about the sun again." But the Germans weren't prepared for the ferocity they met. A captured German officer later admitted, "We did not expect Africans in the snow. It was as if the empire had stretched across the world and punched us in the face." By the end of the battle, the German attack had collapsed. The line held. Bodies lay across the frost-covered mud. The price of victory was written in blood and breath. For the first time, European commanders realized something. These African soldiers were not just reinforcements. They were war changers.
Act 3. The charge at Verdun, when the Empire bled for France. Verdun was not a battle. Verdun was a furnace, a 10-month slaughterhouse where the earth itself seemed to scream. Shells fell so thick that entire forests vanished. Mud turned to pulp. Bones surfaced like broken promises. Into this nightmare marched the Tirailleurs Sénégalais. They were told it would be a critical reinforcement. That was the polite military way of saying, "You're being sent to the place where hope goes to die." Verdun had already consumed hundreds of thousands of Europeans, but France was desperate. Reinforcements were thin, morale was thinner, and the German meat grinders showed no mercy. The arrival of African troops caused a ripple of whispers among the exhausted French defenders. Are they ready for this? Do they know what Verdun is? Do we even know? The tirailleurs listened quietly. They didn't need explanations. A battlefield is a battlefield, even if this one looked like the moon had crashed into a cemetery. When they reached the front, a French officer pointed at the horizon. "You will hold that ridge." The ridge wasn't a ridge anymore. It was a pile of shattered stones and frozen corpses. But orders were orders. The night before the assault, the temperature dropped so low that rifles froze. One tirailleur wrapped his weapon under his coat and muttered, "If this gun wants to fight tomorrow, it must sleep warm tonight." Another said, "If death is looking for me, let him bring a blanket." Humor is their shield against madness. At dawn, the German artillery opened up. Verdun shook like a wounded animal. The tirailleurs braced themselves. When the order came to charge, they surged forward, boots slipping on ice, shells bursting overhead, bayonets glinting like silver teeth. And then something happened that stunned the French officers watching through field binoculars. The African battalions did not break. They accelerated. Like a wave-gathering force, they struck the German line with brutal precision. Trenches were taken, machine gun nests were overrun,
Prisoners were captured in clusters, many of them too shocked to understand how men from Africa had appeared out of the icy smoke of Verdun. One German diary entry read, "They came at us as if the cold did not touch them. We fired and fired, but still they advanced." Of course the cold touched them. Of course their bodies suffered. They just refused to let winter kill what courage kept alive. By the end of the offensive, the ridge was secured at a devastating cost. Many tirailleurs remained on the battlefield, their names unrecorded, their graves unmarked. Verdun would later become a symbol of French endurance, but hidden beneath that symbol are the men whose sweat didn't belong to France, yet soaked its soil anyway. Act 4. The myth of the savage soldier and the propaganda war. Before a single tirailleur fired a shot in Europe, a different kind of weapon had already been aimed at them: propaganda. The Germans feared them, not because they understood them, but because they didn't. To the German High Command, the sight of African soldiers in French uniform was a political insult and a psychological threat. So Berlin launched a campaign that rewrote reality. German newspapers called them savages released into Europe, barbaric tribes used as weapons, France's Black Terror. Of course, none of this was remotely accurate. The tirailleurs were disciplined, trained, and in many cases more professional than the conscripts they fought against. But fear is the oldest trick in war, and the German propaganda machine fed it well. Some German units even carried leaflets warning soldiers, "Beware the Africans. They feel no pain. They do not surrender." If only the tirailleurs could have read that, they would have laughed until their ribs hurt. One veteran later joked, "If I feel no pain, then why did the cold bite me harder than the Germans?" But propaganda had consequences. German soldiers faced them in panic. Civilians whispered theories. And most dangerously of all, the dehumanization justified brutality. Captured African soldiers were often treated worse, sometimes executed, sometimes disappeared. The French, meanwhile, played a different game. They wanted to show their empire standing united. Posters were made showing African, Arab, Vietnamese, Caribbean, and French troops marching together like a global family. A nice idea, one that lasted right up until a black soldier wanted to sit in the same cafe as a French civilian. Then suddenly, the global family remembered its etiquette. And still, the tirailleurs kept fighting, because they weren't fighting for the propaganda. They were fighting for each other. In the trenches of Champagne, one French private said, "The Africans fight like lions." A tirailleur standing beside him replied, "A lion would freeze here. We are colder animals now." Even the British, observing African regiments in action, filed reports saying, "Shockingly effective under pressure." Shockingly effective, as if they expected them to trip over their own rifles. But nothing shocked the enemy more than this. African soldiers adapted to Europe's battles faster than most European recruits. They learned new weapons, new tactics, new terrain, because survival doesn't care where you were born. Over time, the myth began to evolve. The Germans no longer called them savages, they called them France's black elite. Respect born from fear, but respect nonetheless. And yet, despite their battlefield reputation, despite their sacrifices, despite the terror they struck into the enemy, Europe would later try to erase them from the victory. And that erasure begins with silence.
Act 5. The Massacre at Thiaroye, when loyalty was repaid with bullets. Victory in Europe was supposed to mean celebration, parades, medals. A grateful France welcomed home the men who had fought for her. But for the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, victory tasted bitter.
When the war ended, many African soldiers expected what their officers had promised: back pay, equal treatment, discharge bonuses, a ticket home with dignity. They got none of it. In 1944, hundreds of tirailleurs who had survived German prisons were gathered in the military camp of Thiaroye, near Dakar, Senegal. Some had been POWs for years. They had endured hunger, torture, humiliation, and yet, in their minds, they had fought loyally for France. But France had accounting issues. When the soldiers asked for the pay they were owed, money already promised, written, stamped, the French colonial administration responded with delays, excuses, and the kind of financial gymnastics only governments can invent. Your pay must be recalculated. You are prisoners, so your rate changes. We must confirm paperwork in Paris. In the meantime, please be patient. The tirailleurs replied, "We have already been patient for 4 years. We did not survive Nazi camps to be cheated at home." Tensions rose. The soldiers refused to board transport ships until their owed salaries were settled. They weren't rioting, they weren't threatening violence, they simply said, "Pay us what you promised." On December 1st, 1944, before sunrise, French troops surrounded the camp. Tanks rolled in, machine guns positioned, orders whispered. The tirailleurs, still half asleep, barely had time to understand what was happening. And then the shots began. No warning shots, no negotiations, just bullets. When the dust settled, dozens of African veterans lay dead. Men who had survived Verdun, the Somme, Alsace, German prison camps, only to be killed by the very country they fought for. Some historians say 35 died. Others say it was over 300. The truth was buried, quite literally, in unmarked graves. The military court blamed the victims. France closed the file for decades. It was only in 2012, nearly 70 years later, that a French president finally admitted the truth. The massacre at Thiaroye was a tragedy. A tragedy. It was a betrayal so deep that it echoed across generations. One surviving sergeant said before his death, "We carried their flag through snow and fire, but when we asked for our pay, they carried guns." At this moment, the massacre at Thiaroye became the symbol of everything the tirailleurs endured. They were heroes on the battlefield, and colonial subjects the moment the war ended. Their courage was celebrated when convenient and erased when inconvenient. But the story wasn't over, because their fight for dignity had only begun.
Act 6, World War II, when African troops crushed Hitler's armies in Africa and Europe. When World War II erupted, France once again looked across the sea and said, "We need you." And once again, African soldiers answered. But this time, the war wasn't confined to the frozen trenches of Europe. This time, Hitler's empire stretched like a dark shadow across continents, and Africa became one of the first battlegrounds. The Desert Firestorm. In 1940, German and Italian forces flooded into North Africa. Rommel, the famous desert fox, brought tanks that glided across sand like steel sharks. The Allies scrambled to respond. Enter the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, Moroccan Goumiers, Algerian Spahis, and troops from Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. These weren't just reinforcements. They were the backbone of the French African armies. Their first major stand? Bir Hakeim, 1942. A barren wasteland, a forgotten corner of the desert. But for 2 weeks, African troops and Free French forces held off Rommel's elite Africa Corps, a force that outnumbered them nearly 8-1. German radio operators kept reporting the same thing. The black soldiers are reinforcing again. Where do they keep coming from? They came from everywhere France had planted a flag. And they fought like the desert was their home turf, even if many of them had never seen dunes before. A Chadian soldier standing beside a smoldering German tank reportedly said, "In the desert, you must walk slowly. Even death walks slowly here." The push into Europe. By 1943, the African divisions helped crush Axis forces in Tunisia. And once the Nazis were pushed out of Africa, there was no rest. France shipped African battalions straight into Europe, Italy, Corsica, the Alps, Provence. When the Allies landed in southern France during Operation Dragoon, 1944, over 50% of the French troops storming the beaches were African. Let that sink in. The liberation of France, the reclaiming of French soil, began with African boots hitting the sand. Villagers in Provence watched columns of Senegalese, Moroccan, Algerian, and Tunisian soldiers march through their streets. Many had never seen Africans before. Some stared, some applauded, some were confused. One old French farmer reportedly said, "I thought the Americans would come first. Instead, Africa has come to save us." And save them they did. African regiments fought up the Rhone Valley, liberated dozens of towns, crossed mountain passes under fire, and took key German positions in the Vosges Mountains. German officers hated fighting them, not because of racism, but because they fought hard, adapted fast, and refused to break. Hitler himself issued special orders to avoid engaging African units whenever possible. Imagine that. The man who terrorized Europe didn't want his troops fighting African soldiers. The great irony. These were the soldiers who liberated France, but would later be barred from French victory parades in Paris. Heroes on the battlefield, invisible in the celebrations. Their courage was unquestionable. Their recognition, optional. Act 7. The Liberation of France, without the liberators. When Paris was finally liberated in August 1944, the world saw the iconic images. French tanks rolling down the Champs-Élysées, crowds cheering, flags waving, de Gaulle marching tall through the city he vowed to reclaim. But there's something those photographs don't show. They don't show the African soldiers. Not because they weren't there, but because France removed them. The whitening of the liberation. As Allied forces prepared their grand march into Paris, there was a problem. Not a military one, but a political one. The Free French Army, rebuilt in North Africa, was majority African. Moroccans, Senegalese, Algerians, Tunisians, Chadians, Congolese, Madagascar troops, Black, Arab, and Berber units. If these men marched into Paris as the liberating army, the world would see a truth France didn't want printed on the front page. France was freed by its colonies. So orders came from above, quiet, bureaucratic, surgical. For the parade into Paris, only white units should be visible. It was called blanchiment, whitening. African soldiers who had fought across Italy, Corsica, the Alps, Provence, and the Vosges Mountains were pulled back, reassigned, replaced by white troops fresh from training camps who had never heard a bullet whistle past their ear. One French officer protested, "But these African troops earned this." A reply came from higher command. "It will look better for France. Better for France. Worse for the truth." The Parisians who never knew.
As the parade rolled into Paris, the cheering crowds assumed they were watching the men who fought their way home. They weren't. The real liberators, the African regiments, were still miles away, camped outside the city, instructed not to enter unless called. A Chadian veteran later said, "We liberated towns, mountains, and bridges, but not the city of the people we saved." Another remarked bitterly, "The Germans feared us, but the French feared showing us." The invisible heroes. To understand the injustice, imagine this. A Senegalese soldier who fought at Monte Cassino, not allowed to march in Paris. A Moroccan goumier who stormed German fortifications, told he was not needed. An Algerian sniper with 50 confirmed kills, replaced by a recruit who had never fired his rifle in combat. France hid the men who saved it, because an empire is proud in victory, but insecure in gratitude. The footprints that remain. Even though they were excluded from Paris, African troops continued to fight. They liberated hundreds of towns on the way to Germany. They cleared mountain passes, secured supply lines, and pushed the Nazis back step by step. French villagers in the countryside remembered them. Paris did not. But history has a funny habit. The truth always walks back into the room, even if the door was once closed.
Act 8. The Frozen Graves of Alsace and the Battle Nobody Talks About. After being barred from Paris, the African troops were sent somewhere far less glamorous, the icy mountains of Alsace near the German border. It was winter, not cold, winter, the kind of cold that makes your shadow shiver. The French High Command, perhaps trying to hide the very soldiers they had just erased from the Liberation Parade, deployed entire African regiments into the harshest corner of the front, where temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius, rifles froze, boots stiffened, and even fire refused to burn properly. One tirailleur from Mali reportedly stepped into the snow up to his waist and yelled, "This is not snow, this is the revenge of all white ancestors." The Battle of the Colmar Pocket. In January 1945, Hitler launched a last-ditch offensive in Alsace known as Operation Nordwind. The Nazis were determined to retake French soil, and the fighting became some of the most brutal of the entire war. Guess who was sent to stop them? Not the fresh white divisions shown in Paris, not the new recruits, the African veterans. For weeks, they fought in blizzards so thick they could barely see each other. Snow fell like ash. Machine gun nests iced over. German snipers used the white landscape as camouflage. French officers wrote reports saying, "The African troops perform exceptionally despite severe climatic conditions that are unfamiliar to them." Unfamiliar? That was an understatement. For many of these men, the cold felt like punishment. But they fought anyway, because they weren't fighting for Paris, or medals, or French politics. They were fighting for the men standing next to them. The price paid in the snow. Entire companies of tirailleurs were wiped out, holding villages nobody remembers, with names that now sit quietly on road signs. Tuchtheim, Sigelsheim, Jebsheim, Kaisersberg. When the 9th Colonial Infantry Division, composed heavily of African troops, attacked the German lines near Jebsheim, the snow turned dark. The battle was so intense that American units nicknamed the area the Alsatian Stalingrad. One French journalist wrote, "They fought like shadows moving through a white hell." German prisoners later confessed, "We did not expect Africans in winter combat."
yet they fought better than many Europeans. Still, there was no parade waiting for them. No cameras, no applause, just frozen ground and unmarked graves. The silence that followed. When the war finally ended, Alsace celebrated, but the African soldiers who saved those towns were nowhere in the victory photos. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers. Their stories slipped through the cracks, erased by the same snow that tried to swallow them. A veteran from Guinea once said, "My body returned home, but my footprints stayed in the snow." The world remembers Normandy. It remembers Paris. It remembers the flag-raising moments. But the Battle of Alsace, a battle where African troops played a decisive role, remains almost invisible. Invisible, just like the men who froze there.
Act 9. The Long Road Home. Broken Promises and Stolen Wages. When the guns finally fell silent and Europe began stitching itself back together, the African soldiers, the men who bled for France from Italy to Alsace, prepared for one thing: home. Not medals, not parades, not speeches, just home. They wanted to see their villages again, their families, the familiar taste of warm air after years of breathing ice and smoke. And France? France wanted to send them home quickly, but cheaply. The demobilization trick. After World War II, every French soldier, white or African, was entitled to back pay, demobilization bonuses, pension rights, and combat compensation. But when African troops lined up at pay offices, they heard something else. You will be paid a different rate. Your prisoner of war time is not counted. Colonial allowances must be recalculated. We cannot find your paperwork. Paperwork. A magical French word that can erase entire lives. A Guinean veteran later said, "When they wanted our bodies, they found us easily. When we wanted our money, they could not find a single pen." Separate ships, separate pay, separate everything. French authorities forced African soldiers onto special colonial-only ships, not the same transports carrying French white soldiers home. On board, meals were worse, medical care inferior, and sleeping conditions crowded. Many asked the officers, "Why can't we travel together? We fought together." The reply was, "Different administrative categories." Another magical phrase meaning, "We don't want you seated next to white French soldiers." The cutting of pay in Dakar, Bamako, and Cotonou. When they reached West African ports, Dakar, Conakry, and Abidjan, the indignities continued. Some soldiers received half their owed pay. Some received none. Some were told, "Your money will arrive later." Later took 50 years. For some, later never came. A Malian veteran remembered standing in line for 2 days before being told, "There is no record of your service." He simply replied, "But the bullets that hit me, do they have a record?" The politics of invisibility. France wanted two things. One, to avoid paying the full cost of colonial soldiers, and two, to acknowledge that these men had been the backbone of the French military. If France admitted that African troops liberated European cities, then France had to admit that it needed Africa, and colonial powers don't like looking needy. So newly independent France, post-1945 France, revised the archives, rewrote the pension system, and introduced frozen native wages, a policy that locked African veterans' pensions at 1945 rates, 1/5 of what white veterans earned. Imagine risking your life in the Alps, the Vosges, or Casino, only to return home with a pension smaller than a French milkman. A historian once wrote, "France liberated itself from Germany, then liberated itself from its responsibilities." The Quiet Rebellion. Many veterans refused to accept silence. They wrote letters. They formed associations. They marched. They demanded justice. Their fight after the war was longer than the war. One Senegalese sergeant said in the 1970s,
We survived Hitler. We survived the snow. We survived the trenches. But the thing that defeated us in the end was French paperwork. Paperwork, the enemy no soldier can shoot. But the story wasn't finished, because the world was about to remember them, one voice at a time.
Act 10. The Fight for Memory. How history tried to forget them, and how they refused to disappear. The war was over. The uniforms were folded away. The rifles are locked in storage. The world moved on, or pretended to. But the tirailleurs, they carried the war in their bones. Some returned to villages that barely recognized them. Others came home with wounds no doctor could see. The silence of comrades left in snow. The weight of promises broken in offices far away. And worst of all, history shut the door behind them. The era of forced forgetting. France, rebuilding and rebranding itself, wanted a clean story. Brave resistance fighters, heroic white free French, the nation that rose again. African soldiers did not fit neatly into that narrative. So textbooks omitted them. Newsreels ignored them. Monuments rarely mentioned them. A Senegalese veteran recalled a French officer telling him, "You fought well, but France needs its own heroes now." Its own heroes. As if African blood spilled on European soil was foreign. The frozen pensions. Decade after decade, veterans sent letters asking about their pensions. They received bureaucratic nonsense, missing documents, excuses, silence. Some were told their pensions were frozen based on colonial pay scales, meaning a French veteran could buy a house, an African veteran could buy maybe a bicycle. A Ghanaian veteran laughed bitterly in the 1990s. "They froze our pensions the same way the winter froze my toes in Alsace." The first cracks in the wall of silence. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, their children and grandchildren started asking questions. Why is grandfather's uniform hidden? Why does he have medals but no pension? Why does France not speak his name? Journalists dug. Historians uncovered files. Documents surfaced, some forgotten, others misplaced. Suddenly, the story France had avoided for 50 years stood in daylight. The presidential apology. In 2010, during a commemorative event, French President Nicolas Sarkozy finally said, "France owes them everything." In 2012, President Hollande visited the site of the Thiaroye massacre and admitted, "The truth must be told." It took almost 70 years, but the truth finally stepped out of the shadows. The modern recognition. Today, documentaries, films, school programs, and historians are restoring what was erased. Monuments have been raised, streets renamed, veterans honored. But many did not live to see it. One Malian veteran said before his death, "I do not need a medal. I just want my grandchildren to know I was not a ghost." And that, more than pensions, more than parades, is what this story is about. Memory. The Tirailleurs Sénégalais and all African soldiers who fought for France were not supporting characters. They were not colonial auxiliaries. They were not footnotes. They were frontline soldiers. They were liberators. They were the shield of a country that later tried to hide them. But history has cracks, and through those cracks, truth always grows back. Their courage did not end in the trenches. Their battle continued for recognition. And today, finally, the world is listening. Some heroes fight for their country. Others fight for a country that never fought for them. The Tirailleurs Sénégalais and thousands of African soldiers carried France through its darkest nights, through Verdun, through Italy, through the Alps, through Alsace, through liberation itself. They were erased from parades, but not from history. Their medals may have rusted, their pensions may have been denied, but their courage, that remains untouched. If the world forgot them, then we remember them here.